The hegemony of sovereign worlds had maintained the quarantine corridor for 411 years. Not a wall. Not a minefield. Something quieter and more absolute. A gravitational exclusion zone threaded through 17 star systems, enforced by automated sentinel platforms that had never once been tested. Because no species within the corridor had ever been foolish enough or desperate enough to cross it. Until March 14, 2247. The vessel was designated UNSC Ardennes, a human deep survey frigate weighing in at 84,000 metric tons, armed with what the hegemony would later classify as primitive but organized rail-assisted kinetics and a single spinal mount particle accelerator. She carried a crew of 341 men and women, 9 months of consumables, and orders that had been debated, revised, and argued over for 6 years inside the United Nations Space Command's Strategic First Contact Directorate. Her captain was Commander Yao Odia Nakamura, 43 years old, a veteran of the Europa resource conflicts, holder of 2 distinguished service commendations, and by most accounts the calmest officer in the UNSC inventory. She needed to be. The Ardennes did not stumble across the corridor by accident. Humanity had known about it for 31 years, ever since the Deep Space Array at Proxima Station had intercepted fragmented hegemony navigational telemetry, and 2 decades of analysis had decoded enough to understand what the corridor was, who maintained it, and roughly why. The why was the part that had kept the Strategic First Contact Directorate awake at night. The corridor existed because the hegemony was afraid of something inside it. That something was humanity. Not because humans were powerful. The hegemony's first passive observation of Earth dated to the mid-21st century. They had watched broadcast signals, mapped population centers, tracked industrial output. By every metric they possessed, humanity was a young, fractious, mid-tier civilization with a history of persistent internal violence and a disturbing tendency to industrialize faster than its social infrastructure could absorb. It was that last part that concerned the hegemony's analytical directorate. The rate of change. The speed at which humans adapted, scaled, and, most unsettling, weaponized their own chaos. The quarantine corridor was not a prison. It was a precaution. But precautions, Commander Odia Nakamura had argued in her proposal brief, are only as good as the assumptions that built them. And the hegemony's assumptions about humanity were 31 years out of date. Ardennes crossed the threshold at 0611 hours ship time. She did so slowly, broadcasting on every frequency the UNSC's linguist teams had identified as active hegemony channels, transmitting a message that had taken 4 years to compose and another 2 to translate with any confidence. We are the crew of the United Nations Space Command vessel Ardennes. We cross this boundary not in aggression, but in the knowledge that silence between neighbors is its own kind of danger. We come to speak. We ask that you listen. The Sentinel platforms registered her immediately. Their engagement protocols activated, and then, after a pause of 3.7 seconds that would later be the subject of considerable academic analysis, stood down. Not because they were overridden. Not because they malfunctioned. Because a 3.7-second pause was the exact window in which a hegemony Tier 1 response arbiter, an artificial intelligence older than the Roman Empire, assessed the transmission, cross-referenced it against 4 centuries of behavioral modeling, and determined that no species capable of composing that particular message was likely to be acting in bad faith. The Ardennes sailed on. Inside the hegemony's central deliberation chamber, a structure orbiting the star Carith 7, approximately 40 light-years from the crossing point, 17 sovereign delegates received the Sentinel alert simultaneously. The chamber fell completely silent. Delegate Sovamirith of the Pelion Compact spoke first, in a voice that those who were present would later describe as unusually quiet for someone who had just heard the most significant news in living memory. They came themselves, she said. They did not send a probe. They did not send a signal. They came themselves. No one responded immediately, because the implication was already clear to everyone in the room. Humanity had looked at the quarantine corridor, at the invisible boundary that an interstellar civilization had erected specifically to keep them contained, and had sent a crewed ship. Not a missile. Not a drone. A ship with 341 people aboard. The hegemony's behavioral models had predicted a great many possible human responses to eventual discovery of the corridor. Armed provocation. Aggressive signaling. Political fragmentation followed by competing factions making incompatible contact attempts. They had not modeled this. A single vessel, moving at moderate speed, broadcasting in good hegemony standard, asking to talk. Delegate Vorith of the Cinder Worlds pulled up the tactical schematic of the Ardennes on his display. He studied it for a long moment. The rail batteries, the spinal mount, the standard frigate geometry that was, by hegemony standards, roughly equivalent to a midweight patrol vessel. They armed their diplomats, he said. Not alarmed. Almost respectful. They always have, replied the Analytical Directorate's senior representative, a small, precise being named Kelsuanath who had spent 40 years studying human civilization and had, privately, been expecting this day for at least 15 of them. She had a file on Commander Odiya Nakamura. She had files on all of the Ardennes senior staff. She had studied the UNSC Strategic First Contact Directorate's publicly available doctrine documents. Humans with characteristic peculiarity published their military strategic frameworks. The question before this chamber, Kelsuanath said carefully, is not whether to respond. We must respond. The question is what we are actually responding to. She let that sit for a moment. This is not a first contact event. This is a human telling us, in our own language, that they know we have been watching them. And that they are no longer willing to be watched. The chamber absorbed that. Outside, 40 light-years away, the Ardennes continued its slow, steady transit into hegemony space. Commander Odiya Nakamura sat in her command chair, hands folded, watching the sensor display with the focused calm of someone who had calculated every risk and decided the mission was worth it anyway. Her communications officer turned from his station. Commander, we're getting a response. She nodded once. Put it through. The signal was not a weapons lock. It was not a demand to withdraw. It was a navigational beacon, a precise, clean, encoded coordinate set pointing to a specific location 2.3 light-years deeper into hegemony space. A meeting point. Odiya Nakamura studied it for 4 seconds. Then she looked at her helmsman. Set course, she said. Standard approach speed. All systems nominal. Nobody touches a weapon without my direct order. She paused. And someone tell the crew. They're going to want to know. The Hegemony's Analytical Directorate had a classification system for emerging civilizations that most of its member species found, privately, somewhat disturbing. There were 9 tiers. Most civilizations in recorded history had reached the corridor stage. Interstellar travel, organized political structure, predictable behavioral patterns. Somewhere between Tier 4 and Tier 6. Predictable. Manageable. Civilizations that, when encountered, behaved more or less as centuries of contact history suggested they would. Humanity had been classified at Tier 3 on first assessment in 2019 by Earth's calendar. Aggressive industrial base, unstable political cohesion, early spacefaring capability, high internal conflict index. By 2247, the file had been revised 11 times. The current classification was Tier 2, with a notation that had never before appeared in Directorate records. Behavioral trajectory does not conform to standard developmental modeling. Recommend continuous reassessment. Kelsuanath had written that notation herself, 8 years ago, after reviewing humanity's response to the Europa resource conflicts. A 3-way dispute between Earth's major political blocs over helium-3 extraction rights that had come within 6 weeks of becoming a full-scale war, and had instead resolved through a negotiated framework that economists across the hegemony's member worlds would have called structurally impossible. Humanity had been at the edge of catastrophe. And then, somehow they hadn't been. She had flagged it not because it was impressive, but because it was unpredictable. And unpredictability, in civilizations with industrial-scale weapons capability, was the variable that made Directorate analysts lose sleep. Now she stood before the full 17-delegate chamber and presented her assessment of the Ardennes situation with the measured precision that 4 decades of academic work had given her. The vessel's armament is not the concern, she said, pulling up the technical schematic. At current hegemony fleet disposition, the Ardennes could be neutralized by a standard patrol wing in approximately 4 minutes. The crew almost certainly knows this. She paused to let that land. They came anyway. That tells us something important about how humans calculate acceptable risk. Delegate Sovamirath of the Pelian Compact, a species with 700 years of first contact history and a deep institutional suspicion of anything they hadn't modeled, leaned forward. Could this be a provocation? A test of our response threshold? Possibly, Kelsuanath said. But consider the message they transmitted. They told us they know about the corridor. They did not demand its removal. They did not threaten consequences. They asked to speak. She clasped her hands behind her back. A civilization conducting a provocation does not ask permission. Unless the asking is the provocation, said Delegate Vorath. Then we are already in a context where refusing to speak is itself a strategic choice with consequences, Kelsuanath replied. And I would argue that those consequences favor humanity, not us. The The chamber stirred. She pressed on. For 400 years the corridor has functioned as a containment. Humanity was inside it, unaware. Now they are outside it and aware, and they have chosen diplomacy as their first move. If we respond with force or withdrawal, we answer a diplomatic gesture with hostility. What does that tell every other civilization in monitored space about how the hegemony treats emerging worlds? That was the argument that mattered, and the chamber knew it. The hegemony's moral authority, the foundation of its 22-member coalition, rested on a consistent record of principled engagement. For centuries of careful, considered policy. You did not throw that away because one frigate made you nervous. But Kelsuanatha's private concern was not the chamber's political calculations. It was something she had been sitting with for 8 years, since she'd written that notation in the file. She had spent her career studying civilizations. She had watched dozens of them reach the interstellar stage, had reviewed the historical records of dozens more. And there was a pattern, consistent enough that the Directorate treated it as near law. Civilizations that survived their own weapons capability did so by developing proportional caution. They slowed down. They became more deliberate. The violence in their history became a weight they carried carefully. Humanity had not slowed down. The Europa conflict had brought them to the edge of war, and instead of retreating from that edge they had used the experience as fuel. Military doctrine had been overhauled. The UNSC had been restructured. Deep space survey programs had tripled in scope. And within 2 decades, they had decoded enough hegemony navigational telemetry to understand they were being watched, composed a diplomatic message in a language they had never officially been taught, and sent a crewed vessel across a boundary that every other species in monitored space had never once approached. Not because they were reckless. Kelsuanath had studied Commander Oduya Nakamura's service record, the Ardennes mission brief, the years of preparation behind this single crossing. This was not recklessness. This was what humans looked like when they were being careful. That was what made her careful. Meanwhile, aboard the Ardennes, the mood was something that didn't have a clean word for it. Not fear. Not euphoria. Something in between, the specific emotional register of people who had trained for an event for years and were now inside it, discovering that training and reality were related but not identical. Lieutenant Commander Priya Vashistha, the Ardennes senior contact specialist, had spent 3 years studying hegemony communication protocols. She had practiced responses to 17 distinct contact scenarios. She had a binder, an actual physical binder because some things you didn't trust to digital storage, containing phonetic guides, cultural sensitivity notes, and a 6-page document on hegemony concepts of protocol and hierarchy. She was now staring at a navigational beacon that had come in response to their message and trying to determine whether meeting at the designated coordinates was an invitation or a controlled approach vector. It could be both, said Senior Analyst Tobias Fewer from across the contact station. He was reviewing the signal encoding with the expression of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and was running on ship's coffee and the specific adrenaline of historic moments. The coordinate set uses standard hegemony diplomatic encoding. We've seen this format in the intercepts. It's what they use for sanctioned meeting points. Which means, best case, they're bringing us in for a formal contact. Worst case, they're bringing us somewhere with good fields of fire. Vashistha considered that. And if it's both? Fewer almost smiled. Then we go anyway because that's what the orders say. The orders said, if contact is established and a meeting is proposed, accept. Do not hesitate. Hesitation communicates uncertainty. Uncertainty communicates weakness. This mission proceeds or it does not. There is no middle position. Oduya Nakamura had written that section herself, in the pre-mission doctrine brief, 6 months before departure. Vashistha had read it so many times she could recite it. She pulled up the coordinate data and began the formal approach calculation. The meeting point was in the outer halo of a red dwarf system, neutral territory by hegemony convention, she noted. Not a hegemony core world. Not a military installation. Deliberately chosen to be non-threatening. They were being met halfway. She logged the calculation, flagged it for the commander, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that might have been wonder before returning to work. Outside the viewport, the stars of hegemony space glittered with 4 centuries of civilization she had never seen and was now, impossibly, sailing toward. They were going to be the first humans to meet an alien intelligence face to face. The weight of that was enormous. She carried it the way her species had always carried enormous weights. She kept working. The meeting station was called Vareth Null in hegemony standard, which translated approximately as the place between. It was not a metaphor. The station had been constructed 311 years ago specifically as a neutral contact facility, a place where emerging civilizations, when they eventually stumbled into hegemony space, could be received without the psychological weight of being brought directly into the heart of an established interstellar power. It was, in its own way, a compassionate design. The hegemony had learned, from early contact history, that overwhelming a new civilization with the full scale of what they were joining had a tendency to produce poor outcomes. But Verithnol had not been used in 47 years. The environmental systems had been reactivated 6 hours before Ardennes arrival. The atmospheric calibration, Earth standard, pulled from hegemony monitoring data, had been running for 3. When Commander Odiya Nakamura and her contact team stepped through the docking collar and into the station's primary reception chamber, the air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen with a slight metallic undertone. Close enough to a ship's atmosphere that it was almost comfortable. She had noted that. Filed it. There were 5 hegemony representatives waiting for them. Kelsuanath she recognized from the intelligence profiles, a compact, bipedal being with pale gray-green skin, large dark eyes, and an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that took considerable practice. The others represented the Pelian compact, the Cinder Worlds, and 2 species the UNSC's files didn't have confirmed imagery for. The chamber itself was large, deliberately so. High ceilings, indirect lighting, a long oval table with seating calibrated, she noted with professional admiration, to accommodate bipedal species of varying heights. Whoever had prepared this room had done their research. She stopped 2 meters from the table. Her team, Vashista, Fewer and 2 others, stopped with her. She did not offer a hand. The gesture wasn't in the protocols and might not translate. Instead, she inclined her head, a small, deliberate bow, and spoke in English, which her translator unit rendered into hegemony standard with a half-second lag. Commander Yael Odiya Nakamura, United Nations Space Command. I represent the people of Earth and our colonies. We're grateful for this meeting. Kelsuanath inclined her own head in a motion that was slightly different, deeper, slower, but clearly in the same register. Senior Analyst Kelsuanath, Hegemony Analytical Directorate. On behalf of the Sovereign Council, we acknowledge your crossing and accept this contact. Pause. The kind that fills rooms when history is being made and everyone in them knows it. Then Kelsuanath did something that was not in any of Vashista's binders. She gestured to the chairs, not a formal protocol gesture, just a quiet, practical motion, almost human in its casualness. Please sit, she said. We have considerable ground to cover. The first 6 hours were mostly information exchange. Calibrated, careful, structured, Vashista and Fewer working alongside their hegemony counterparts to establish translation baselines, verify mutual comprehension, lay the groundwork for anything more substantive. What emerged in those 6 hours was a picture that was simultaneously more complex and more manageable than either side had feared. The hegemony was not a monolith. It was a coalition of 22 species, each with its own internal politics, its own institutional memory, and its own feelings about the question now sitting at the center of their table. Some member worlds had advocated for making contact with humanity years ago. Others had pushed for extending the corridor indefinitely. The 17-delegate council that had authorized this meeting had done so by a margin of 11-6. Odiya Nakamura absorbed that carefully. A fractured coalition. 6 dissenting delegates. That was information. For their part, the hegemony representatives were recalibrating their own assumptions in real time. The UNSC's mission briefing documents, which Vashista had brought physical copies of, correctly anticipating they would be requested, were being read with something that Kelsuanatha's expression suggested was either deep interest or profound concern. Possibly both. Your mission parameters, Kelsuanath said during a brief recess as she reviewed the briefing with Vashista, specify a return window. 12 months, after which a second vessel will be dispatched regardless of contact outcome. That's correct, Vashista said. And if we had responded to your crossing with force? Then the second vessel would have been different from the first. Larger. With a different mandate. Kelsuanath looked at her steadily. You planned for failure. We planned for all outcomes, Vashista said. That's not the same thing. It wasn't a threat. Vashista's tone was matter-of-fact, almost academic. But Kelsuanath recognized what it was. A transparency that was itself a form of message. We are showing you our contingency plans because we want you to understand how seriously we take this, not because we expect to use them. It was, she thought, a very human kind of honesty. Uncomfortable and direct and oddly reassuring. The 6th hour brought the first genuinely difficult moment. Delegate Vorith, who had said little during the formal exchange, raised the question that had been hanging over the chamber since the Ardennes crossing. "The corridor," he said. "You know what it is. You know why it was built. We will not pretend otherwise, and we assume you will not either." He paused. "How do your people intend to respond to its existence?" The room went quiet. Odiya Nakamura had prepared for this question. She had prepared for it across 6 years of mission development, had written drafts and discarded them, had argued about it with the Strategic First Contact Directorate in sessions that sometimes went past midnight. She had a diplomatic answer ready. She had a firm answer ready. She had a conciliatory answer ready. She used none of them. "With understanding," she said. "We read the corridor as fear, not hostility. And we understand fear. Our history is largely built on it." She let that breathe for a moment. "But we also know, from that same history, that walls don't resolve the thing that built them. They just delay the conversation." She looked at Vorith directly. "We're here to have the conversation." Vorith held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Kelsuanath with an expression that, even across the barrier of completely alien facial anatomy, Odiya Nakamura read clearly. "She's not what we modeled." Kelsuanath's response was equally readable. "No. She's exactly what I modeled." The meeting continued for 3 more days. By the end of the first session, both sides had agreed on a framework for ongoing contact. By the end of the second, they had established a preliminary communication protocol and identified 12 areas of potential mutual interest. By the end of the third, something that wasn't quite friendship but was its necessary precursor had settled into the room. When the Ardennes undocked and began its transit back toward the corridor, Odiya Nakamura filed her initial contact report. The document ran to 340 pages and took 11 hours to dictate. At its conclusion, she added a commander's note that she had not pre-drafted. "The hegemony is large, ancient, and watching. They are also genuinely uncertain about us, which I believe is to our advantage, provided we do not mistake caution for weakness on either side. My assessment: this is the beginning of something that will take decades to understand fully. We should approach it accordingly, seriously, carefully, and with the clear understanding that how we conduct ourselves in these first years will define the relationship for generations. We crossed their line. Now we have to be worth crossing it for." The Ardennes returned to UNSC space after 11 months, 4 days, and approximately 16 hours of transit. She came back with 340 pages of contact documentation, 14 terabytes of encrypted hegemony cultural and scientific exchange data, 3 preliminary framework agreements, and 341 crew members who had aged, visibly, in ways that had nothing to do with time. The debriefs took 4 months. What emerged from them, processed through the Strategic First Contact Directorate, the UN Security Council, and 17 specialized academic review bodies, was a picture of the galaxy that was simultaneously more complicated and more navigable than humanity had imagined from the outside. The hegemony of sovereign worlds was not, as some theorists had feared, a monolithic empire waiting to absorb or eliminate any civilization that reached the interstellar stage. It was a negotiated coalition with deep internal disagreements, a 400-year-old institutional framework that had survived mostly because no member species had found a better alternative, and a collective anxiety about human civilization that was, in many ways, a more credible form of respect than admiration would have been. They were afraid of what humanity might become. That fear, properly handled, was leverage. The Strategic First Contact Directorate understood leverage. In the 6 months following the Ardennes return, 3 things happened that would later be identified as the turning points of what historians came to call the transition period. The first was the hegemony's internal restructuring. The 6 dissenting delegates who had voted against the contact meeting were not removed or disciplined. The hegemony's political culture didn't work that way, but the 11 who had voted yes were given expanded portfolio authority over what was now formally designated human engagement policy. Kelsuanath was elevated from senior analyst to director of engagement, a newly created position that had no precedent in hegemony administrative history. She accepted it with characteristic precision and immediately commissioned a comprehensive revision of all existing human behavioral models. The models, she noted in her commissioning brief, were no longer useful. They had been built on observation from outside the corridor. They now needed to be built on conversation. The second was humanity's response to the exchange data. 14 terabytes is a large amount of information. Most of it was linguistic, cultural, and historical, the hegemony's equivalent of what humanity had transmitted, a structured introduction designed to establish common context. But threaded through the cultural material were fragments of scientific data, not shared deliberately, but present in the background of communication protocols, administrative records, and navigational standards the way oxygen is present in air. The UNSC scientific teams found three things in those fragments that rewrote sections of human physics. Not overturned, refined, extended, redirected. Humanity's understanding of gravitational field dynamics improved meaningfully. Fusion efficiency modeling received a 15-year acceleration. And a theoretical framework for what the hegemony called resonance mapping, a navigation technique that humanity had been developing independently, more slowly, under a different name, snapped into focus in ways that cut the projected development timeline by a decade. None of this was accidental on the hegemony's part. Kelsuanath would later confirm that the scientific fragments had been authorized by the Council's science delegates as a measured gesture, a way of demonstrating good faith without making a formal technology transfer that the dissenting delegates could object to. It was, she acknowledged privately, also a test. They wanted to see how quickly humanity absorbed it. The answer was, quickly. The third event was the one that changed the broader galactic context in ways neither humanity nor the hegemony had fully anticipated. The hegemony was a coalition of 22 species. It was also, by nature of its size and age, something that smaller civilizations in its vicinity oriented themselves around. Some as members, some as client states, some as cautious neighbors who traded and stayed out of hegemony internal politics. There were, by UNSC estimates, somewhere between 40 and 60 civilizations within signal range of hegemony space that were watching the human contact situation with interest. When news of the Ardennes meeting propagated through those civilizations' information networks, which it did within 8 months, because information in a galaxy with faster-than-light communication does not stay contained, the response was not what anyone had predicted. 3 separate civilizations sent formal inquiries to the hegemony requesting clarification of their own engagement policy status. 2 others, previously in long-standing territorial disputes with hegemony member species, reopened diplomatic channels they had closed decades ago. And 1 small, technically modest civilization called the Ithrani Collective, a species that had been in a low-level cold conflict with a hegemony border world for 60 years, made a formal request that was unprecedented in hegemony records. They asked to speak with a human representative. Not a hegemony delegate. A human. The message they transmitted explained why, in terms that Kelsuanath found alternately fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. The Ithrani had been watching humanity's contact approach, had obtained transcripts of the Ardennes original transmission and the subsequent meeting framework. They believed, as their message put it, that a people who can speak to the hegemony as peers, despite having only one ship in their space, might speak to us differently than the hegemony has. This was the part that nobody had modeled. The Ardennes mission had been designed as a bilateral first contact, humanity and the hegemony, one relationship to establish and navigate. But the watching galaxy had drawn its own conclusions from the event, and those conclusions were already reshaping dynamics that the hegemony had managed, carefully and with considerable effort, for centuries. Kelsuanath brought the Ithrani request to the Council in a session that she later described, in private correspondence, as the most interesting meeting of my professional life. The 11 engaged delegates understood immediately what it meant. The 6 dissenting delegates understood it differently, as confirmation that their concern had been warranted, that the human presence in hegemony space had already become a destabilizing variable. Both assessments were correct. You predicted this, Delegate Vorath said to Kelsuanath, during a private recess. I predicted the contact would have downstream effects, she said carefully. I did not predict the specific shape of them. Is that reassuring or alarming? She considered the question honestly. It means the humans are acting as a genuine independent variable rather than conforming to our models. That makes them harder to plan around. And the Ithrani request? She looked at him steadily. If we refuse it, we tell every civilization watching this situation that the hegemony managed the human contact specifically to preserve our own position. If we grant it, we acknowledge that humanity has, in the span of one mission, become a diplomatic actor in regional politics. Vorath absorbed that. And your recommendation? Grant it, she said. Because refusing it changes nothing about what humanity already is. It only tells them we know it. In the UNSC Strategic First Contact Directorate, the Ithrani request arrived as a 3-line communiqué that caused a day and a half of organized chaos before Director General Amara Osei called the room to order and reminded everyone that the mission doctrine had anticipated derivative contact situations. We prepared for this, she said. Not exactly this, but the category. A third party wants to speak with us through the context of the hegemony contact. That's a category we have protocols for. She pulled up the roster of available officers. Commander Odia Nakamura was on medical leave. 11 months in deep space, doing the most consequential work of her life, had left marks. She would return. But not yet. Osei looked at the roster. She needed someone with Odia Nakamura's quality, calm, precise, capable of carrying the weight of history without being crushed by it. She found 3 candidates. She interviewed all 3 the same afternoon. By evening she had made her choice. The galaxy was not waiting for humanity to be ready. It was already in motion, already reorganizing itself around the fact of humanity's presence. The only question was whether humanity would organize itself fast enough to navigate that motion with intention. Osei had spent 30 years in the Directorate understanding that the answer to that question was always the same. It had to be yes. The Shovari Dominion did not send a message. They sent a position. Specifically, 6 of their heavy interdiction vessels repositioned from their standard patrol routes to a cluster of waypoints that, on a navigational chart, formed a clear arc across the most efficient approach vector between human space and the Varith Null Contact Station. It was not a blockade. Legally, technically, precisely, it was not a blockade. The vessels were in Shovari sovereign space, conducting what their official communique described as routine defensive exercises. They were not firing on anyone. They were not threatening anyone. They were simply there, in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to make a point. Kelsuanath received the navigational data and the communique simultaneously. She read both twice, then set them down and stared at her desk for a long moment. The Shovari were one of the 6 dissenting voices in the Sovereign Council. More than that, they were the most consequential of the 6. Their species was the 3rd oldest in the Hegemony Coalition, their military capability the 2nd largest, and their institutional memory long enough that they could point to specific historical moments where the hegemony's principled engagement with emerging civilizations had produced outcomes that cost Shovari lives. They were not irrational. They were not warmongering. They were a civilization with 700 years of hard-won pattern recognition, and the pattern they were reading in the human situation was one they had seen before, in a different context with a different species, and it had ended badly. Kelsuanath knew the historical case they were invoking. She had studied it herself. 80 years ago, the hegemony had extended formal engagement to a species called the Veth Meryl, young, industrially capable, strategically intelligent. The engagement had been conducted in good faith on both sides. And then the Veth Meryl's political structure had shifted, a new coalition had taken power, and the good faith framework had become leverage in ways that had taken 30 years and considerable diplomatic cost to unwind. The Shovari had lost 3 colony worlds in the fallout. Not to war, to economic pressure and resource redirection that the Veth Meryl's new administration had weaponized with precision. They had not forgotten. Their concern about humanity was not that humans were violent. It was that humans were adaptable. The Shovari's own analysis of human history had flagged the same variable that haunted Kelsuanath's files: the rate of change. A civilization that could pivot from the edge of self-destruction to accelerated development in a single generation was a civilization that could pivot from cooperative partner to strategic competitor just as quickly. And unlike the Veth Meryl, who had been a single political entity with a predictable power structure, humanity was fragmented. The UNSC represented Earth and its colonies, but it was not a government. It was a military and exploratory coordination body. Earth itself had multiple major political blocs. The colonies had their own interests, their own politics, their own relationship with the UNSC that was, by all accounts, sometimes cooperative and sometimes contentious. The Shovari were not afraid of Commander Odia Nakamura. They were afraid of the version of humanity that might come after her. In the UNSC's directorate, the Shovari vessel repositioning was flagged within hours of its occurrence. Director General Osei called a situation assessment. The room filled with people who had opinions, and she listened to all of them before speaking. "This is political signaling," she said, when the room had exhausted itself. "Sophisticated, carefully calibrated political signaling. They are telling the Hegemony Council that the dissenting position has force behind it, and they are telling us that our presence in hegemony space has created a fault line that is now visible. It's also a test," said Deputy Director Harlan Mwangi, who had spent 15 years in the Directorate studying hegemony internal politics. "They want to see how we respond. Whether we escalate. Whether we back down. Whether we try to go around them." "All 3 responses confirmed their concern," said Senior Analyst Fatima Al-Rashid, who was young enough to say the uncomfortable thing out loud. "Escalation confirms we're aggressive. Backing down confirms we're unreliable under pressure. Going around confirms we'll work outside agreed frameworks when it's convenient. The room absorbed that. So what's the fourth option? Osei asked, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to hear it said. Al-Rashid said it. Acknowledge them directly. Don't go through the hegemony. Contact the Shovari ourselves. The room reacted. Most of the reaction was skepticism. The Shovari had not made contact with the UNSC. They had made a positional statement to the hegemony. Responding directly outside the established hegemony framework was a significant protocol deviation that the hegemony's engaged delegates might interpret as destabilizing. Or, said Mwangi slowly, they might interpret it as exactly the kind of independent diplomatic capability that makes humanity a more credible long-term partner. Osei nodded. She had already reached the same conclusion. Draft a communication for the Shovari Dominion. Not a protest. Not a demand. An acknowledgement of their position and a request for direct dialogue. She paused. Use the same encoding and protocol format we used for the original Ardennes transmission. Make it clear we've done our homework. The Hegemony Council will need to be informed. Inform them simultaneously. Not before. Not after. At the same time. She looked around the room. We are not asking for permission to have a conversation. We're demonstrating that we can have multiple conversations, responsibly and transparently at the same time. It was the right call. It was also the call that proved to anyone watching that the UNSC's approach to galactic politics was not naive. The Shovari received the UNSC communication 11 days later. Their response took 3 weeks, which the Directorate's analysts interpreted as a deliberate pacing choice, long enough to suggest they had taken the message seriously, short enough to indicate they were genuinely willing to engage. The response was formal, measured, and contained one line that Al-Rashid read 3 times before flagging it for Osei. We do not object to your presence. We object to the hegemony's assumption that they can manage the consequences of your presence on your behalf. Osei read it once. Then she called Kelsuanath directly. They had established a secure communication channel, a first in hegemony human contact history, and read her the line. Kelsuanath was quiet for a moment. They're not wrong, she said. No, Osei agreed. They're not. It was an uncomfortable truth that both women sat with separately. The hegemony had structured the human contact as something it was managing, a process it controlled at a pace it set within frameworks it designed. That was not entirely cynical. It was how the hegemony managed contact with all emerging civilizations, and it had generally worked well. But humanity had not behaved like all emerging civilizations. And the Shovari, despite their adversarial positioning, had seen clearly what the engaged delegates had not fully reckoned with. The human contact was not something the hegemony was managing. It was something the hegemony was participating in. The 6 Shovari vessels remained in their positions for another 4 months. They did not interfere with any traffic. They did not escalate. They were a presence, a reminder that the galaxy's response to humanity was not unanimous, not simple, and not finished. When they finally returned to their standard patrol routes, no official announcement was made. No communique. No formal acknowledgement. But 3 weeks later, the Shovari Dominion's ambassador to the Hegemony Council made an unscheduled request for inclusion in the next human engagement policy briefing. Not opposition. Participation. Kelsuanath filed the request with a note that she allowed herself 1 sentence of satisfaction in composing. The Shovari are not our adversaries. They are the most honest voice in the room. Commander Yael Odia Nakamura returned to active duty 14 months after the Ardennes docked at Ganymede Station. She had taken the medical leave because her CMO had recommended it, and because she was honest enough with herself to recognize that honest recommendation. 11 months in deep space was manageable. 11 months in deep space carrying the weight of species-level first contact, in an environment of sustained uncertainty where every decision had potential civilizational consequences, was something else. She had slept badly for most of the mission. She had not let it show. She had returned home, submitted to 4 months of debriefs, and then, because stopping was harder than continuing, had tried to return to the work immediately. Her CMO had grounded her with a quietness that was more effective than argument. She spent 14 months in Nairobi where she had grown up, doing things she had not done in a long time. Sleeping a full night, eating meals that took longer than 12 minutes, walking without purpose. She read. She spoke with her family. She gave 3 lectures at the University of Nairobi's new Department of Interstellar Studies, a department that had not existed when she left, and discovered that she had thoughts about the Ardennes mission that she hadn't had time to form while she was living it. The lectures were not triumphalist. Colleagues who had expected her to narrate the mission as a great human achievement were surprised to find her more interested in what the mission had revealed about both sides. The hegemony's genuine uncertainty, the structural complexity of the coalition, the way Kelsuanatha's careful professional demeanor had occasionally cracked into something that looked, across the barrier of alien biology, like worry. "They are afraid of us," she told a lecture hall of 400 students, most of whom were young enough that the Ardennes crossing was the first major historical event they clearly remembered. "Not in the way you might think. Not afraid of our weapons or our numbers. By their standards, we are a small civilization with modest military capability. They are afraid of what we represent. A civilization that changes faster than they can model. That is, if you think about it carefully, a profound kind of respect." A student asked the question she had been expecting since the first lecture. "Do you think we're safe? Now that they know we're here?" She thought about that for a moment. "I think the question of whether we're safe misunderstands the situation," she said finally. "The galaxy was always there. We were always going to reach it eventually. The question was never whether we'd be safe once we did, it was whether we'd be ready. Ready to be honest about what we are, to listen as well as we speak, to take the long view when the short view is easier." She paused. "I think we were ready enough. I'm not sure we were ready. There's a difference." Back in the directorate, the work had continued without her, necessarily because the galaxy did not pause for 14 months. The Ithrani dialogue had been established, managed by Captain Darius Achabe Park, who turned out to be exactly the kind of officer Osei had hoped she was selecting. The Shovari were participating in engagement policy briefings. 2 additional hegemony member species had requested direct communication channels with the UNSC. And the data exchange had continued, slowly and carefully, building toward something that both sides were approaching with deliberate patience. The scientific transfer was the most visible dimension of this. The 15-year acceleration in fusion efficiency modeling had produced 2 functional prototype designs within 18 months. Gravitational field dynamics research had opened a new line of inquiry into jump drive efficiency that was already attracting the best theoretical physicists humanity had. The resonance mapping framework was being developed jointly, with hegemony and UNSC research teams in communication through the formal exchange protocol, a first in itself. But the less visible dimension was, Oduya Nakamura thought, more important. People were learning each other. Not governments. Not institutions. People. The linguists and analysts and scientific liaisons who were spending long hours in correspondence with their hegemony counterparts, building the working relationships that would eventually become the substrate of something more durable than any treaty. Vashistha had been in regular communication with a hegemony cultural analyst named Kethavora for 10 months and had told Oduya Nakamura, during one of their informal calls, that Kethavora had a dry humor that translated surprisingly well across species. "She sent me a document," Vashistha said. "A 100-year-old piece of hegemony literature about a diplomat who spent his career trying to explain one civilization to another. She said it reminded her of our situation." "What did you send back?" "A copy of The Ugly American," Vashistha said. "With annotations." That, Oduya Nakamura thought, was how it was supposed to work. Not grand gestures and historical pronouncements. People reading each other's books. People annotating them. She returned to the directorate in March. Osei briefed her for 3 hours on the current status, then handed her a new assignment. The hegemony had requested a standing diplomatic presence. Not a mission, not a temporary contact team, but a permanent human representative office at Varith Null Station. It was a significant ask. It implied a permanence and a formality that the contact had not yet formally adopted. It also implied that the hegemony's engaged delegates had won enough internal political ground to make the offer. "They're ready to make it official," Osei said. "And we need someone to run it." Osei looked at her steadily. Oduya Nakamura understood. "You're asking me to go back." "I'm asking if you want to go back." That was different. Osei was not giving her an order. She was asking a question. Oduya Nakamura thought about 14 months in Nairobi. The lectures. The sleepless nights that had eventually become sleeping nights. The understanding she had arrived at, slowly and with considerable difficulty, about what the Ardennes mission had cost her and what it had given her. She thought about Kelsuanath, whom she had exchanged 17 formal messages with over the past year, careful, professional correspondence that had occasionally, at the edges, become something slightly warmer. She thought about Varith Null Station with its Earth-standard atmosphere, its oval table, its indirect lighting. She thought about what it would mean to build something there that lasted. "Yes," she said. "I want to go back." She had one condition. She requested that Vashistha and fewer be assigned to the permanent office. Osei agreed without deliberation. They were the obvious choices. The announcement was made quietly, a UNSC press release technically worded, that nonetheless produced 3 days of intensive media coverage on Earth and across the colonies. Humanity's first permanent diplomatic presence in hegemony space. The phrases being used in the coverage were large ones. Odiya Nakamura read the coverage from her office in the Directorate building and felt the weight of those phrases settling, understanding that the gap between what the moment felt like from the inside and what it looked like from the outside was part of the job. From the inside it felt like paperwork, logistics, personnel decisions, the unglamorous labor of making something last. From the outside it looked like history. Both were true. That was the thing people who hadn't done this work sometimes missed. History was mostly logistics. The moments of consequence were brief, and what determined their meaning was everything that came after. She had learned that on 11 months aboard the Ardennes, and she was still learning it now. She began packing for Verithnol. She packed her physical binder of hegemony cultural notes, considerably annotated since the mission. She packed 3 books, including the copy of The Ugly American that she had given Vashistha and Vashistha had returned to her, now with hegemony script annotations and Kethavora's handwriting on several pages, with a translation key stapled to the back cover. She packed that one carefully. The permanent human diplomatic office at Verithnol became operational on a date that Earth's calendar marked as April 3, 2249, almost exactly 2 years after the Ardennes crossing. There was no ceremony. Odiya Nakamura had specifically requested that. The hegemony had offered one, a formal recognition event that would have involved all 17 council delegates and she suspected, a considerable amount of ritual that neither side would have entirely understood in real time. She had thanked Kelsuanath for the offer and declined it on the grounds that ceremonies were for completed things, and this was not completed. It was beginning. The office occupied a reconfigured section of Verithnol's administrative ring. 11 rooms, 3 staff quarters, a communications center, a small library of exchange materials in both human and hegemony formats, and a meeting room that was, by Odiya Nakamura's deliberate choice, slightly smaller and less formal than the original contact chamber. She wanted a working space, not a monument. She spent the first week in organizational meetings with the hegemony's newly established Human Engagement Bureau, Kelsuanatha's direct creation, staffed by analysts and liaisons drawn from across the coalition's member species, with a mandate that was, by hegemony institutional standards, unprecedented in its scope and ambiguity. The Bureau's formal charter described its purpose as facilitating mutual comprehension. Kelsuanath had written that language herself, choosing it over more specific alternatives because she understood that the work was not, at its core, a specific task. It was an orientation. In their first working meeting, she and Odiya Nakamura sat across a table in the smaller room with cups of respective beverages. The hegemony's preparation of Earth-standard coffee had been improving incrementally over 2 years, and was now merely unusual rather than alarming, and discussed the agenda for the next 6 months. The Shovari have submitted a formal request to participate in the next joint scientific exchange, Kelsuanath said. Odiya Nakamura raised an eyebrow. The joint scientific exchange was 3 months old and had been, to this point, a bilateral arrangement between the UNSC and the hegemony's science directorate. The Shovari's participation would make it multilateral, a structural change with significant implications. That's a significant shift, she said. Yes. Kelsuanatha's expression was measured. They want to participate in the resonance mapping collaboration specifically. They have research that they believe is relevant. Do they? Almost certainly. The Shovari have been developing resonance mapping independently for 60 years. Their theoretical framework is different from ours and from yours, but the underlying mathematics are compatible. She paused. It's very good research. You've reviewed it? They sent it to me informally. As context for the request. Kelsuanath set down her cup. They are not entering this collaborative framework as dissenters. They're entering it as scientists. Odiya Nakamura thought about that. The Shovari's trajectory over 2 years had been one of the more instructive things to watch. A civilization that had begun the human contact period as the most credible voice of concern and had gradually, without ever formally reversing their position, shifted from adversarial watchfulness to cautious participation. They had not changed their minds about the risks of human civilization. They had changed their assessment of what participation in the contact process was worth, relative to standing outside it. Approve the request, she said, and send Delegate Vorith a personal note. He'll appreciate knowing we're glad they're at the table. It was the right call. And it was, she thought, the kind of call that nobody outside these rooms would ever know about, the small decisions that kept the architecture standing. Over the following months and years, the architecture grew. The joint scientific exchange expanded from 3 disciplines to 11. The resonance mapping collaboration produced its first joint paper, 34 authors, 9 species, one conclusion that overturned a fundamental assumption in gravitational physics that all 3 development traditions had shared independently, and the paper was cited, within a year, by researchers in 4 hegemony member civilizations and 2 non-member species who had obtained it through secondary channels. The Ithrani Collective's dialogue, managed through the Human Diplomatic Office, with hegemony participation but not hegemony mediation, produced a framework agreement with their border world dispute partner that held. Not perfectly, not without renegotiation, but it held. Captain Achebe Park, who had managed the Ithrani relationship for 18 months, wrote in his assessment that the key element had been something he hadn't expected. The Ithrani had simply wanted to be spoken to as peers. Not managed. Not processed. Spoken to. They told me, he wrote, that the hegemony had always spoken to them from a position of authority. That they had assumed this was simply how more powerful civilizations communicated. When we didn't, they didn't know what to do with us for the first 3 meetings. And then they understood and they started talking. His assessment circulated through the directorate as required reading. The Shovari, true to their nature, never fully relaxed their watchfulness. But watchfulness, exercised honestly and transparently, turned out to be a useful thing in a collaborative framework. In scientific sessions, their researchers asked the questions that made other teams stronger. In diplomatic briefings, their analysts identified structural weaknesses and proposed agreements that the engaged parties had missed. They were not comfortable partners. They were honest ones. Kelsuanath observed all of it from her position, slightly elevated, slightly apart, as director of engagement's role required, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent 40 years building toward a moment that had arrived differently than she expected and better than she had dared to model. She had expected the human contact to be consequential. She had not expected it to be generative. What humanity had brought into hegemony space was not, in the end, primarily a military capability or a scientific capacity or a diplomatic framework. Those things were real and they mattered, but they were not the deepest thing. The deepest thing was a particular posture toward the unknown. Humanity had looked at the corridor, at a deliberate boundary constructed by a civilization far older and larger than itself, specifically designed to contain human development, and had responded not with rage, not with submission, but with a kind of principled curiosity. They wanted to understand the boundary before they contested it. They wanted to speak before they acted. That posture had changed the room. And the room, over time, was changing the galaxy. Not through dominance. Not through technological superiority or military pressure or any of the mechanisms that traditional power operated through. Through the slower, more durable mechanism of credible presence. The demonstrated ability to engage with complexity honestly, to build trust where suspicion was justified, to remain in the room for difficult conversations without either capitulating or escalating. Other civilizations were noticing. Some, like the Ithrani, had reached out directly. Others were watching from further distances, processing what they were seeing, updating their own calculations. In the Directorate's analysis files, the number of monitored civilizations flagged as reassessing contact posture had grown from 3 to 11 over 18 months. The galaxy was moving. Not toward humanity specifically. Not in ways that were simple or predictable. But the contact had created a new reference point, a new data set in the galaxy's long calculation about how civilizations related to each other, and reference points changed trajectories. On the evening of the Permanent Office's 2-year anniversary, Odiya Nakamura sat in the small meeting room after the last working session had concluded, with a cup of now reasonably adequate coffee and the hegemony annotated copy of The Ugly American open on the table in front of her. She wasn't reading it. She was thinking. 2 years ago, she had sat in a command chair aboard the Ardennes and watched a navigational beacon resolve on her sensor display and made the call to follow it deeper into space. It had been the right call. She had known it was the right call, but knowing something is right and knowing how it will land are different things, and the distance between them is where the weight lives. The weight was still there. It was smaller now or she was larger. She wasn't sure which. Kelsuanath stopped in the doorway. She had a habit of working late, and she had learned, over 2 years, that Odiya Nakamura's light in the meeting room after hours meant she was thinking rather than working and was usually willing to talk. Significant thoughts? Kelsuanath asked. Odiya Nakamura looked up. Calibrating. Kelsuanath came in and sat down with the ease of someone in a familiar room. She had her own version of coffee, a hegemony preparation called something unpronounceable that Odia Nakamura had made one genuine attempt to learn to enjoy, then gracefully abandoned. I have been reviewing the directorate's projection models, Kelsuanath said. The 20-year estimates. And? They're wrong. As I expected. A slight pause. Not in the direction of pessimism. In the direction of caution. We modeled conservatively, assuming friction and delay at each stage. There has been friction. There has been some delay. She looked at Odia Nakamura steadily. There has also been the Shovari joining a scientific collaboration they had no institutional framework for. There has been the Ithrani framework holding. There have been 11 civilizations reassessing their postures. She set down her cup. The models are wrong because we were modeling for resistance. What we did not model adequately was the possibility that the contact would function as a demonstration, that other civilizations would draw independent conclusions from watching it succeed. Odia Nakamura was quiet for a moment. We didn't model it because we weren't trying to perform for an audience. No, you were not. Something shifted in Kelsuanatha's expression, subtle but readable after 2 years. That is precisely why it worked as a demonstration. Outside the station's viewport, the stars of hegemony space turned slowly, the same stars they had been for billions of years, indifferent to the small, consequential conversations being conducted in their light. The galaxy was large and old and full of civilizations working out, one difficult interaction at a time, what it meant to share it. One human vessel had crossed a line. Not in conquest. Not in desperation. In the specific, grounded courage of a species that had learned, through considerable suffering and occasional grace, that the hardest conversations were the ones most worth having. The galaxy was never the same. Not because humanity had changed it by force. Because humanity had changed it by showing up, honestly, carefully and without flinching, and staying in the room. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took one ship to prove it.